So the question we want to look at in this section is, why do we need a PA system? Why do we need to amplify anything at all? I want to start by saying that this weekend I had the pleasure of going to the Royal Albert Hall. My company has the contract to do audio-visual production at the Royal Albert Hall. And I was there just listening as a customer, as a member of the audience, listening to Carl Jenkins do a performance of The Armed Man. Now, Carl Jenkins is an orchestral composer and he's a choral composer, and The Armed Man is a beautiful piece of music which is effectively the marriage of choir and orchestra. And to be honest with you, in this scenario, I want to hear it as it is. I don't want it to be reinforced. I don't want it to be embellished. I want just the acoustic experience. However, it is true that in the Albert Hall, I was blessed to be sat pretty close to the front. Now, the Albert Hall has a capacity of something in the order of 5,500 people. And if you're sitting in the top galleries and the top tiers, it is very unlikely that you're going to hear that orchestra and that choir without any reinforcement, because you're just too far away, and a 80, 90, 100 piece choir just is not acoustically loud enough to fill the whole of the Albert Hall. In this sense, at the very minimum, we do need to consider some amount of sound reinforcement. This is where we use a PA system to lightly enhance what's being heard, just to put a little bit more detail, a little bit more energy back into it, and deliver sound pressure at reasonable distance. So what does this mean to somebody who is in church? Well, the first highest priority for a sound system in church is that it can deliver the message of the gospel. We want the preacher to be heard. And so at very minimum, we're thinking about a speech reinforcement system which will allow vocals to be reproduced throughout the body of the auditorium. First of all, a church is quite a complex building, and it's going to have all sorts of nooks and crannies, such that if I was to stand at the pulpit and deliver my message, it's probably likely that the distribution of my voice in the building is going to be blocked by pillars and other obstructions. There may be balconies, I may be underneath the balcony and effectively shadowed by the structure of the very building in which I'm trying to listen. For this reason, we use a sound reinforcement system to distribute audio in the body of the church, to make sure that everybody, no matter where they sit, has a direct source of audio that's coming from a speaker when they have no line of sight, maybe, to the person who is making the presentation. Most important in this area is the distribution of high frequencies, the frequencies of the S's and the T's that allow people to hear intelligibility in the depth of the venue. I want people to be able to hear the detail of what's being said. In later sections, we're going to look at the details of the reverberation of space. And I'm going to do quite a lot of great stuff with you on understanding how reverb gets generated in a large church building or auditoria. This is no longer your front room. We're considering a large space, maybe with 100, 200, 2,000, 20,000 people, and we need to understand what happens with speech when we try and talk into such a space. The main challenge will be the one of intelligibility. This is the point where we lose our ability to hear what's being said from the person and we hear just the venue. This would be the cathedral experience of sitting at the back of a venue. You can hear that somebody is mumbling words, mumbling and stumbling over their own words, but you just cannot hear any detail of what's being said. The primary role of a PA system, therefore, is number one, sound reinforcement of the spoken word so that we can hear the gospel clearly in every seat. However, it's not only speech that we're having to distribute in the audio system that we put into a modern church. The genre of worship is really important to the life of the church. We need to make sure that our sound systems are able to faithfully reproduce the music styles that we have in our church, congregation, and music groups. Even if you're involved in what I'm going to call folk worship, this is where you have a band, maybe with a keyboard and a guitar and a few vocals, it's likely that this music material is in the modern era being delivered to people with a much higher sound pressure level than a basic sound reinforcement system for a church is able to cope with. If we try and run reasonably high level of folk orientated worship vocals and guitar keyboards through a system which does not have available headroom, it will just sound distorted, unpleasant and stressed. This stress is coming from the fact that the PA system in this situation has been designed for simple speech only and is effectively distorting when we apply the dynamic range required to faithfully reproduce live music of whatever genre. This is even more critical when our music style of worship tends to the more pop, gospel, contemporary style with guitars, bass, drums, electric guitars, many vocals, the full range experience. I appreciate this is probably, I am guessing, but this is probably why you're watching this video, because it's this very type of music reproduction that you're interested in improving in your own churches. It's likely that in the modern era, you are dealing with yourselves and a congregation whose expectations have been set by the iPod generation. We are all used to listening to very high-class recorded material, even in our front rooms in 5.1 stereo, or in our cars in glorious stereo, or even directly injected into our ears, and our expectations of quality of audio have gone incredibly high over the last decade. The problem that we have in the churches is that our own sound systems have not kept up, and we are trying to do the same thing with live music to try and reproduce the experience that people are listening back on CDs, even in their own front rooms. Just like with every other form of presentation, we've moved into using computers to show words on the screen. Even the oldest pastors, older than me, are now using iPads to deliver their messages. We are in the era of modern media production. In order to answer the question, why do I need a PA system? If you try and do live music production without a suitable system that will carry headroom, that will allow the production of high dynamic range music without nasty compression and limiting that becomes really harsh to the hearing, you are going to disturb your congregation and not meet expectations. Another reason which we need a PA system is that all buildings are noisy. They carry their own noise of central heating systems. They might have creaks, they might make noises themselves, but one thing that does make noise in a venue is the congregation. If you get together 500 people, it's very hard for those people to sit silent. We do have this thing called the Lombard reflex, and that means that a presenter will naturally try and raise their own volume in a room to beat any noise source that they detect in the room. If you have a noisy environment where you're trying to speak to a large crowd without any help from a PA system, it becomes incredibly stressful. You spend your whole time in reinforced vocal effort. Now, if you have a degree of confidence, I'm reasonably confident as a speaker, this is all well and good, and you can raise your energy to match the situation. But if we want our churches to be open to people to contribute who may not have such internal power to deliver, then we absolutely need a PA system to reinforce somebody who might be quite softly spoken but still deserves the right to be heard. What we're dealing with here is the management of expectations. If you've been to any Christian conferences in the UK, it's likely that you've heard SFL's work. And we are in a situation where people's expectations are basically set upon those kind of events. It's very difficult to come back home and do that within your own home church. It's even more difficult if you cripple yourselves by not having the right tools to do the job. We have a saying in the company that says every church will buy 3 PA systems. The first one will be installed by a very keen church volunteer. The second one will probably be maybe bought from the music shop down the road, and the third one will be bought to meet proper expectations from a professional audio company. Now generally, we can only deal with selling the third system. In this, we appreciate that you'll be watching this DVD probably for one of two reasons. You're either a sound engineer who's trying to understand what tools are available so you can do a better job of your service to the church. Or you might be a pastor or a trustee or a worship leader who is trying to understand what needs to be bought, what needs to be refitted or refurbished in the church so that you can do a better job of sound reinforcement. It's worth bearing in mind that most of the time in a church maybe of a capacity 200, 300, even up to 1,000 people, we are often doing a job of sound reinforcement. The band's stage noise is going to be significant even without PA. The sound of a snare drum being hit is going to be significant in the venue even without the sound system turned on. So what we are doing with a modern PA system is using high quality speakers to add to that experience, to balance what's already coming from the acoustics of the band. What we are not trying to do is make this into some kind of studio mixing experience where we're trying to come up with some hi-fi mix that makes no sense in the context of the live venue. In fact, if you have ever taken a rough left-right recording of your live desk and you listen back to that at home, you will often find that it doesn't really make sense as a proper mix that you could listen to without the live context of the congregation and the band's own stage sound. Now, I have been involved in mixing events where there might be 45,000 people in the same space, and in that scenario, pretty much the stage sound that's being made is irrelevant in the depth of the venue. Once you are 10,000 people back from a stage, you can't really hear anything that's going on the stage itself. And in that situation, we could argue that our job is a total mix job where we can't hear the stage sound at all. However, on a day-to-day basis, in most churches, this is a fine balance between mixing stage sound with PA sound to obtain the correct context. The job of live music is to keep it live. We are not trying to reproduce a studio listening experience. People can already get that at home. It's emotive to a degree, but it's not fully immersing. I truly believe that live music, live worship should be something that's experienced in a church space with the congregation and the band working together for one overall sound. In terms of thinking about a PA system and why you need one, we need headroom. We need speakers with high degrees of efficiency that can keep up with the modern dynamic range of a live band. When you listen to a CD at home, there has been a lot of production, a lot of compression to take out all of the changes, to implement levels of control that we can never implement in the live scenario. This is why any PA system that we install needs to be, if you like, oversized. I do not mean that the speakers need to be huge. I just mean that the capability needs to be in excess of what we would otherwise think. At home, you might think that a 50-watt amplifier is a big amplifier. In the world of live sound, we would regard a kilowatt, a 1,000-watt amplifier, as being a large amplifier. When you start to consider your PA systems, please do not get scared that you are being sold something which is oversized. I would remind you in this sense of oversizing that this speaker on my right-hand side happens to be a very compact live sound speaker of very high quality, but even though it's small, we still drive it with a 1 kilowatt amplifier. To finally conclude on why you need a PA system, it's to meet people's expectations. And it's really important that if you're going to spend money, that you spend it wisely, and instead of going through PA system number 1 and PA system number 2, that you make your first purchase the only purchase you need to make.